I really believe you're probably the best-selling author who is currently a pastor.
I have 5 levels when I read a book. Level 1 is an underline. Level 2 is an asterisk. Level 3.
Well, Pastor Mark, it is a privilege to be here in DC, in your house, your church.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad we made this work. I want to say this is episode 159, and you were the very first person I ever interviewed. The first one.
Wow.
Yeah.
I got in on the IPO.
Yep.
The initial public offering.
Yep.
Logan, that's awesome.
We were in a small closet. I don't know if you remember this. It was a small closet, and we were using microphones that are meant to be used for a stage, not these, podcast microphones.
Yeah.
And very first interview I ever did. So 159 episodes, 3 years later. Isn't that crazy?
Look at that. And it was a little awkward in that closet.
It was. But, it was tiny.
But, born in Minneapolis, so I have an affinity, and we have a few fun memories together, and absolutely love you, your family, hold you in such high regard. So it's just fun to sit down again. And a lot has happened in those last 158 episodes.
Yes. And I'm honored to continue it on. And hopefully it doesn't take 158 more to get you back again. But
okay.
I was writing down goals and things that I wanted to talk about in 2025. And one of the things that kept continuing to come up, and I would kind of ask the audience, and hey, what do you want to talk about? I'd send feedback. And communication is just something that every pastor wants to grow in. I mean, everyone wants to become a better communicator. And there's ways to grow your communication skills, but I think a lot of it starts with crafting a story. And so I thought, who better to talk to than the best storyteller I know, right? There's books right behind us for those that are watching. You've written how many books now?
25.
25 books. And so, you're 26 years old when you're starting a church, right? And you've now written 25 books, which is just crazy to think about. And God's done a lot on the way, but I'd love to talk about, how do you know a story's worth telling? I'm sure you do your research and you have stuff that doesn't make the book. It doesn't make the sermon. How do you differentiate that? And so obviously it's a big question, but where's the starting point when you're researching, when you're trying to find material for your upcoming book or for your upcoming sermon? Do you just circle it in the book? Are you a paper book reader, or take us through that process a little bit?
Okay, ready or not, here we go. And I'll try to share just a few hacks that I think have helped me over the years. So I am a reader, and I better put this out there. It took 13 years. I felt called to write at 22, but I didn't write a book until 35.
Wow.
So 13 years, but I knew that good writers were probably good readers, and so I read 3,000 books before I wrote one.
3,000?
And and that sounds like a lot. I was reading a couple hundred books a year. But listen, Teddy Roosevelt read 500 books as a sitting president per year. Warren Buffett said he spends about 6 hours a day reading. So I just knew I'm going to not just read these books, I'm going to reverse engineer and kind of figure out. And part of the reason, Logan, is I had taken an aptitude assessment at 22 that showed a low aptitude for writing. In other words, whatever you do, don't write books. It's not a natural gifting. But over time, you figure out what you like to read. And so read a lot of books in preparation, but here's the hack. I never read a book without a pen. What's the point? I need to be able to underline, but I have 5 levels when I read a book. So I can go back on my shelf to any one of those 3,000 books or any book I've read since. Level 1 is an underline. Level 2 is an asterisk. Level 3, I circle it on the page. Now we're getting good. This is good stuff. Level 4, upper dog ear. And level 5 is a lower dog ear. So I can pull about any book off of the shelf. And it's weird. I don't have a great memory verbatim, but I can always remember what book I read it in and even where it was on the page. And it was about 2/3 of the way through the book. So that's kind of what I've done over the years. So I'll give one example. I picked up this thick kind of a compilation of the Talmud called the Book of Legends years ago. And page 202 changed my life. I discovered this guy named Honi, the circle maker. And I thought, wow, that's a great story. I'm going to use that as an illustration. And then after I used it as an illustration, I'm like, wait, I think that's a book. And so what's fun is I think there's a genealogy or a genesis to about every sermon, every illustration, every book. I think it's just about being really good at kind of cataloging and creating almost your own Dewey Decimal System.
That's so fascinating. And is Circle Maker, is that your best-selling book that you've written so far?
It is. Thank you. Yeah. Look at this. It is. It's almost hard to get out of the shadows of that book because it sold a lot of copies.
Well, yeah. Can I just drill down on that?
Yeah.
Like you mentioned that obviously there's some weight in what you just said there.
Yeah.
The shadow of yesterday. The impact of that book is still today.
Yeah.
Somebody maybe even listening had never heard of that book. Somebody at the bookstore or a friend gave it to him. So the impact of that book is still going on. But you wrote it a while ago.
Yeah.
As a creative person,
yep.
It's the next. I mean, our songwriters always, it's like, well, we don't want to sing the old songs. We want to sing the new song.
Yeah.
How have you balanced, like, if people invite you to a conference or, they want the greatest hits. Well, why didn't you play the song I like? Or why didn't you preach the sermon I wanted? But you have this freshness in you as somebody who balances that creativity. Like, how do you balance that?
Well, you know how you have to hear something 7 times for it to really kind of get from your head to your heart? In the same way, in my sermons and in my writing, I almost allow myself about 15% carryover. That there are some stories that are too good to only tell in one book or one message. Now, I will say this, like when I'm looking for getting ready to write a book, what I'm really looking for is an organizing metaphor. In other words, a story that creates kind of a big enough framework. And that's how I open most of my messages, usually a interesting piece of history, a scientific study, maybe a story from my life, but something that begins to kind of frame out what it is that I want to talk about, because you have so little time these days. There's one study that suggests that attention span is down to 8 seconds, which is shorter than a goldfish. So you got to get in pretty quick and set the hook. So I spent an inordinate amount of time on the opening illustration of a sermon and the opening chapter of a book. And now I can't remember the original question.
No, I mean, it's about creativity and how you stay fresh, knowing that what is old,
yes,
is still helping people, but it's not fresh for you, right?
Yeah.
Getting out of the shadow.
Well, for me, I'd be curious what your strengths finders are. One of mine is ideation. So I'm always on the hunt. If I learn something new, I'm like, that's awesome. So like if I discover that you not only have a unique fingerprint, voice print, eye print, you have a unique sweat print. The 373 chemicals that comprise sweat combine in a unique way that it makes you unlike anybody else. We can't smell the difference, but your dog can. I love stuff like that. And by the way, speaking of dogs have unique nose prints, which makes me love my dog even more. So it's that kind of stuff. I think there's just a innate curiosity that, and part of it, Logan, I think this is important. Like I started out at University of Chicago, like as a pre-law major, but I took this class in immunology. And I remember walking out of a class praising God for hemoglobin, which I wasn't even sure how to spell it. But we have 30 trillion red blood cells, each with 260 million hemoglobin that deliver oxygen to the cells in the body. And I remember walking out thinking that embryology is a branch of theology, that whole class was like an exegesis of Psalm 139, that we're fearfully and wonderfully made. So I think Scripture's in a category by itself as the inspired Word of God. And you don't just read it, it reads you. But I think anything and everything, all truth is God's truth. So I think that's what I begin to kind of geek out on. But I think every communicator has to find their lane. In fact, I want to talk about the Grammys for a second because the Grammys set me free, and I'll explain why. But let me give one little example. John 9, the man born blind, he was born blind, which means that there was no synaptic pathway between the optic nerve and visual cortex in the brain. So this isn't Jesus healing an astigmatism. This is Jesus literally doing synaptogenesis, installing a new synaptic pathway in a blind man's brain. And so if you understand like a little bit about neuroanatomy, well, then theology, it adds dimensionality to our theology. So I feel like, man, there are communicators that are a lot funnier than me, a lot smarter than me, know Hebrew better than me. I just know my lane, Logan, is I try to say old things in new ways. I like to cross-pollinate, and because I think that's how people learn. And I think Jesus was kind of the master of metaphor. The kingdom of heaven is like. So I think that may be, and I'm literally processing as we talk. Like, this is not stuff I really think about a lot, but yeah, I think that's kind of the way I'm wired.
Yeah, and I think that we, just like a song, we remember songs much better than we do words. We remember stories much better than we do concepts, right? But those things help us to understand them. And speaking of songs, you mentioned Grammys, and so I wanted to pull that.
Yes. So I'm not a big music guy, but just happened to be watching the Grammys years ago, and I was really struggling, and because I would travel and maybe speak at some of these conferences where you've got some of the best communicators on the planet, and I was playing the comparison game and just, I wish I was as funny as that person, or could call and response as well as that person, and all of us, as soon as my ego is completely sanctified, I'll let you know, wouldn't hold your breath. We're all works in progress. Like when we have a guest speaker, I want him to do good, but not too good. It's that kind of thing. But I was watching the Grammys and I thought to myself, how silly would it be for someone who is a country artist to be jealous of someone who's a rapper, who's jealous of someone who's just kind of a pop or R&B or any other genre. And there was something about it that, Mark, God gave you your voice. You aren't going to be this person or that person, but just be comfortable in your own skin. Kind of do what you do. Keep learning and growing. And I always want to learn from other people. But there's just something about being true to your authentic voice that I hope those who are listening just maybe take a deep breath and, okay, like I don't have to be TD Jakes. I don't have to be Stephen Furtick. I don't have to be whoever it is that you love as a preacher. Keep listening to them, learn from them, but you be you.
Yeah, I feel like you might have poured salt in the wound for those listening recently when Beyonce won Greatest Country Album. Where there's some artists that just they can bounce around.
And listen, there are a few communicators. You know what's funny? Malcolm Gladwell is one of my favorite authors because of his ability to dabble in so many different kind of fields and genres and. But there are very few, let's just be real, there are very few Beyoncés in the world.
Yes, no doubt. And I think that there are some that are more generalists. There are others that somehow look like they're specialists in multiple areas. But I'm fascinated. I mean, sometimes people in our church will say, I don't know how my job gives God glory. I'm like, well, what do you do? And I pave driveways.
Yeah.
And I'm like, every single time a family comes home, before they go greet their kids, before they go kiss their spouse, they drive over that asphalt.
Wow.
and they get to see their family, and you make a way for them to come home. And it's
Yep.
like,
Come on.
I just think about that stuff. And I
That's
know some people are
awesome.
like, oh, you're over spiritualizing it. I'm like, no, you have to realize that again, what does he say about the church, the body? We're all different parts.
Yep.
And if you go about your life and your career, oh, I'm only a children's pastor, I'm only a this. No, if you didn't minister to that child, they may not follow Jesus if it weren't for that. Their
Yep.
parents, if maybe they didn't have a place to put their child, maybe they wouldn't come to church, whatever it is.
Yep.
And I can see that so clearly. You talked about the strength finders, like futuristic, strategic, I can
Yeah.
see the pathways. And when we were engaged, my wife and I were working with the strengths finders coach, and she said, Logan, you can see the path from point A to point B and all the paths to get there. She said, your problem is you assume everyone else can see it, and you don't bring them on the journey with you, and so they get frustrated with you.
Yep.
And I've had to realize that and grow in that, because to me it's just so obvious that, well, that's how it connects to the big plan.
Yeah.
And I've had to realize that, first of all, sometimes I'm wrong, and that's a good realization. But other times it's just showing people that and bringing them on that journey.
Wow. Really interesting. Random, but Richard Branson, Virgin Airlines, his whole philosophy of leadership is ABCD. Always be connecting dots. And there's something about, like, I'm intrigued by your ability to kind of connect certain dots, because I do think a large part of leadership is pattern recognition. Whether, and that's true if you're an offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator for the Minnesota Vikings, or anyone else.
Coach of the year. Hey.
Yes, coach of the year. Or you're a pastor or a business leader. I think it really is that ability to kind of see. In fact, I would, right now we're in a building that was the 1891 Navy Yard car barn. And so 100,000 square feet, city block, but it was carved up into little classrooms, drop down ceiling. But I've come to realize that vision is seeing through drywall and drop ceilings that are not load bearing. Like, you have to, you have to be able to see things that aren't there yet. And I know that's a little off the track of what we're talking about.
It's
but,
related. Yeah.
Are you familiar with desire pathing in urban planning?
I'm not.
Oh, you're going to love this. Because it's kind of our approach to how we have started building out in phases some of the buildings that we have. When an architect designs a college campus, they don't put sidewalks down. They wait and see where the foot traffic naturally falls, and then it's revealed to them, well, here's where we need to. So it's called desire pathing. And I think there's just something about that a lot of leadership is desire pathing. And it seems like that might be one of your giftings, but then it's kind of helping other people see the path too, for sure.
Yeah, I feel like for me, it's sometimes like, well, no, people are gonna walk there, so let's put a sidewalk down. But again, when you're right, you're right. But when you're wrong, you've already got too far ahead of yourself.
Yeah.
And so that's something that comes with humility.
Yeah.
A question I had back to your kind of cataloging, because I mean, it's brilliant. And obviously you have a lot of experience doing that. You're working on books all the time, and you're writing, and maybe we'll get to some of your writing process if we have time. But how do you balance a story and retelling it and plagiarizing? Because sometimes you read a book and you get a great idea and a great story. How do you know, like, this is a story I want to tell and I want to expand on, versus you're just retelling the same story? And some of it is like, it's fair use. It's not a big deal. I mean, like, my dad will say, like, use my sermons and steal it, take whatever.
Yeah.
Like, it's all from the Bible. Like, we're all in this together. But when it comes to a book that's being sold, or it comes to kind of a message that you're crafting, I don't know. I've just felt that tension of, like, I love that whole page, and I almost want to just, like, take the whole page and put it in my work.
Yeah.
And I texted you that I'm working on a book, and so part of this is just selfish.
Yep.
And that's the joys of a podcast too.
Yeah.
But how have you balanced taking ideas and making them your own versus just ripping them off?
Right. I think you just, over time, as you're reading books or listening to people's lives, you just have this internal filter, like, oh yeah, that's a story that I'll give you an example. Kevin Warren, former COO for the Vikings, and now with the Chicago Bears, president CEO. So I saw him a couple of months ago. I went out and actually did chapel for the Bears and the Vikings. And as we were walking out of that chapel, he said something to me. He said, "Mark, I don't do meetings." I'm thinking, what do you mean you don't do meetings? You got to be meeting with vendors and sponsors and players and coaches. Like, your whole life has to be meetings. He said, "Mark, I don't do meetings. I do relationships." Well, that was my opening story this last weekend in our series, Relationship Goals. And what I'm doing is celebrating Kevin as someone who has that rare ability to make people feel seen, heard, and loved. And so I'm sharing the original source, but then I'm challenging our congregation. Hey, you don't have meetings this week. You have relationships waiting to happen. So it's that kind of thing. You just, and Logan, I would say one other hack would be, I always have my journal when I meet with people. So two rules of life, lots of rules, but here's two. One, everyone is my superior in some way, and that I learn of them. So I always want to have a pen and journal ready to kind of jot down notes. And then a second one is everyone's fighting a battle I know nothing about, and that I empathize with them. So I want to have kind of that mindset. Much of this picked up from my spiritual father, Dick Foth, that I've never met anybody who was more interested in people and asked better questions. Who left their fingerprints on your soul? Like, that's the kind of, and he'll just kind of dig into your story. And so I want to capture those stories. And then if it's from a book or a biography, I just have learned, like, oh yeah, that's a story that illustrates something that is worth telling. So I think you begin to catalog those. But Logan, the way I see it, like, here's the way I would explain it. When I was 19, I heard Sam Farina preach about a guy named Benaiah who chased a lion into a pit on a snowy day. And I tucked that story away for 16 years. And then wrote a book, In a Pit with a Lion on a Snowy Day. Sam knows every time I see him, I honor him. Every time I see Sam, I'm like, Sam, I'm so grateful. Like, you told a story that then for me became the organizing metaphor for a book. So, like, even when I write, my hope and prayer is like that pastors would take it, use it, speak it in their own voice. And so that's kind of, I have kind of an open source sort of mindset.
Yeah, and I find that most of the people who are creating content and who have that knack to create realize how hard it is to create. And I feel like most of the conversations I have with people is very open-handed. I think the people who are close-handed are the ones who have the idea they've never done anything with, and they think that if someone steals it, that's going to be the end of it. But like my dad always tells our team, he says, preach your best sermon now. Don't hold on to your best sermon.
Come on.
Because your best sermon now may not be your best sermon forever, just like your best-selling book now may not be your best-selling book. And I think so many of us, we hold on to, maybe it's a thing you felt like, that's a great social media post that I just feel in my spirit that I want to tell people. And it's like, but I'm going to wait for the perfect time. Or I'm going to wait for this. I mean, that we could do a whole podcast on just waiting. And I read a book, I don't know if you've read The War on Art or The War of Art. And not a Christian book, but he said something, and I wrote it down. Maybe I'll look it up to get the exact quote. But he said, resistance is the enemy of creativity. And the whole book is about resistance. I'm going to pull up the quote.
Interesting.
Here we go. Genius's shadow is resistance. Stephen Pressfield. And I just found it so true to where the ideas that are in our mind and think of all the things that could be. That never find their way on paper, that never find their way in sermons. It's like, that's why I'm inspired by you, because you keep writing books, you keep preaching sermons, you keep doing that. How have you fought against that resistance? I last time on the podcast, again, right at the beginning, you were talking about how Spurgeon had dealt with depression. Everyone fights resistance.
Right.
How have you press through when maybe it's the building permit doesn't get through, or it's the money doesn't come in, or you're writing the book and it just doesn't feel like it's coming together? Do you just have a strong sense of internal motivation? Is it just you have great cheerleaders?
Yeah, there's a little bit of holy stubbornness that if there's a dream, we're going to outlast any opposition. We're just going to keep on keeping on. And part of it was having a front row seat to my father-in-law, Bob Schmidgall, who pastored a church for 31 years. And I saw what long obedience in the same direction looks like. And so we overestimate what we can do in a year or two, underestimate what God can do in 10 or 20. And so I've always kind of had this mindset that it's probably going to take longer than I like, be harder than I hope for, but it'll be worth it if you kind of hang in there and keep on keeping on. So, but one key is that 2 Corinthians 10:5, take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. So, I'd rather have one God idea than 1,000 good ideas, but you have to be really good at kind of capturing whatever that idea is. It could be for a sermon or a book, but it could be just a leadership insight. It could be something having to do with interior design, architecture, which are a couple of my passions, but it's just getting really good. At the base of the brainstem, there's this little cluster of nerve cells called the reticular activating system. And our team laughs at me because I always say, it always comes back to the reticular activating system, but it's the part of the brain that determines what we notice and what goes unnoticed. So like if you buy, I won't put you on the spot. I drive a Toyota 4Runner.
I drive a Honda Civic.
Honda Civic, there you go. When you drive off the lot, all of a sudden you see your car every place. Mm-hmm. Well, it's not like everybody went out and bought the car. It's just you now have a category in your reticular activating system for it. So I think good leaders, good preachers, good writers just have a really fine-tuned reticular activating system that you know what you're looking for and you're good at capturing it. Yeah. And so when I sit down to write, Logan, the way I see it is I'm not typing on a keyboard. I'm worshiping God with 26 letters of the English alphabet, and I'm really taking thoughts captive and then making it obedient to Christ, which is laborious. Like the most recent book, A Million Little Miracles, was 688 footnotes. The editing on that thing was brutal. But that's the price you pay. It's a labor of love, but it involves labor for sure.
Do you write every day?
If I'm in a writing season, almost every day.
Can you describe what a writing season is?
Yeah. I think, so for me, I leverage my birthday, November 5th, generally is, okay, I'm in a writing season. Start with a writing retreat, 2 or 3 days. And then I have our teaching team do more of the teaching. So the 25 hours that I would spend on a message, which would be my average, are 25 hours I can devote to writing, which is a slightly different creation, but I'm focused on generating that next book, usually about 3 months, usually about Super Bowl Sunday. This one's taking a little bit longer. I'm in a writing season right now. And this is a rare exception. I don't take outside meetings when I'm in a writing season. But if a friend from Minnesota is in town, we're gonna talk shop.
I'm honored.
But you have to put boundaries in place, and so it's really hard to say no. But the way I see it is, a book is my way of giving 5 or 6 hours of the best of me to anybody, anytime, anywhere. And so you kind of have to make those hard decisions. So about 3 months, give or take, is my writing season, and with a writing retreat to kind of, I call it tie off the umbilical cord and just begin to give that book a life of its own.
I was chatting with John Maxwell, and he was talking about one of his mentors. And I said, "Oh, how long have you known him?" He said, "Oh, I'd never met him." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Oh, I read all his books."
There you
He
go.
said he's a mentor of mine. I've never met him, but he's a mentor. And I thought that was just so interesting.
Okay. John sent me a text, in fact, after several books, and I think it was Win the Day. He sent me a text and said he had made 77 annotated notes on the book I just written. I'm thinking to myself, first of all, it's incredibly humbling because John doesn't have anything to learn from me. All of us have something to learn from John. But you know what he models is this is a guy that if you stay humble and stay hungry, nothing that God can't do in you or through you, that he is this kind of quintessential lifelong learner. I remember, do you remember a guy named Elmer Towns? Back in the day, he wrote like this book about the 10 fastest growing churches in America, like kind of a guru in church world. I was at a conference once with him when he was 86 years old. And my hand got tired watching him write notes in his journal, listening to some young buck church planner share their experience. And I'm thinking, yep, that's it. Like, I want to keep learning until the day I die. And John embodies that. Elmer embodies that. And I want to be that kind of person.
Well, I believe you are. I mean, just the years we've known you and your family, it's you walk with humility, and obviously that's a trait that I think we all would love to have. But you walk with humility with success. I mean, I was thinking about this on the way here, and I'm sure this isn't something you bring up because of your humility, but I really believe you're probably the best-selling author who is currently a pastor. I mean, I can't think of somebody in that's currently pastoring that has sold more books. And again, like we're friends with the Beveres and John Maxwell and Rick Warren and other, but they're not currently pastoring. And so as I thought about it, I'm like, I'm going to sit down with my friend Mark, who may very well be the best-selling author who's pastoring a church. Now, I mean, obviously that's not something you've given a ton of thought to, but I'm honored by knowing you because of the humility you carry. And even for you giving me this time today, I feel like it's just a testament to that. And so really, I just want to say thank you. I have like one more question here before we wrap up, but I don't know, I wanted to pause and just acknowledge the leader you are. I truly mean this. I've never heard like anybody say anything negative about you. And I think it's because you always show them the level of care that you've shown me, and you really do care about people. And so again, I know it's kind of a side tangent, but your story is a blessing to so many.
Well, that's really kind. And it's hard for me to know what to, I don't know that I've spent any time thinking about that. I'm grateful. We drink from wells we didn't dig. We eat from fields we didn't plant, live in houses we didn't build. So I think about, Rick Warren blazing a trail with purpose-driven life. I think about Max Lucado, whose books have impacted so many people. I'm just grateful for them. Eugene Peterson was kind of this pastor author for 30 years, and I've taken tremendous inspiration from them. I love pastoring a church. It keeps you on your toes. It gives you a pulse of where people are at. So, as long as the Lord enables, going to keep doing those two things and find great joy in it. I also know, Logan, every pastor is an interim pastor. And part of my motivation in writing is, praise the Lord. We had a prayer team that prayed with that first book. Lord, put these books in the right hands at the right time. So, Logan, I can genuinely say a book sold is not a book sold to me. A book sold is a prayer answered. And so that's where the joy comes from, that if God can use a book to really impact someone's life. But here's the crazy thing, like the motivation out of the gate was I know next to nothing about my great-grandparents. Next to nothing. Like one story. Barely even know their names. And I would like to think that someday my great-grandchildren would know what I live for and die for and what I bleed and what the blood, sweat, and tears was for. So to me, a book is actually, should the Lord tarry, a book is a time capsule of the third and fourth generation. That's why I write. I think about it when I write. I'm thinking about future generations that I'll sound pretty dated, I'm sure. Like, and they might chuckle at my antiquated thinking or language, but it really is. You have to live for the applause of nail scarred hands. You just have to. And if you start playing the extrinsic motivation game, you're going to run out of gas. And so, I mean, since we're on the subject, I'll just say one more thing. I think if you let celebrity culture into the church, you're putting people on a pedestal, and it's not going to end well. And so, I just think when you reach the highest level of leadership, do not forget that it gives you the right to relinquish your rights, put a towel around your waist, and wash feet. The greatest of all is the servant of all. And I have a lot of growth to do in that area. But that's kind of my mindset that, hey, let's keep taking the lowest seat at the table, showing honor to other people. And I think when you do that, then the Lord knows, maybe just maybe your ego won't get in the way. And I wonder if that's why the Lord allowed that first church plant just to go south. Unless the Lord builds the house, they who labor in vain.
That's good. Well, you've blessed us with your time, and I'm putting you on the spot here. You're in a writing season. And so is there a story that maybe you're working on right now? Or you shared a story, you just preached it, but is there one that maybe is making the book or that you could share with us that you'd say, this is a fresh one that is exciting? Or maybe it's not from the new book, but it's one that's a recent story that you'd say, hey, this one, I don't know if I've told many people this story, but it inspired me. Is there one that jumps out?
Yep. Because if I get a great story, I might use it once, but then I tuck it under my hat because in that case, I don't want anybody else to steal it and write the book. So you want the opening story of the next book? I'll even give you the title. The title is Gradually, Then Suddenly. It was an Ernest Hemingway novel. The Sun Also Rises. Asked the question, how did you go bankrupt? And the rather infamous reply was 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly. That's how you go bankrupt. That's also how you get out of debt. It's how you write a book. It's how you run a marathon. It's how you overcome an addiction. It's how you fall in love. It's how everything happens. It's how Pentecost happens. It's how Jericho happens. So it really is a book that I wouldn't have written even 5 or 10 years ago, but we're on the verge of celebrating our 30th anniversary. And so I thought for the 30th, that seems like a fitting metaphor, gradually then suddenly. So long vision plus long obedience equals long legacy. And that's a little sample.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that sample, and we'll be excited to read it. And remember back to this, that we heard it here first.
I love it.
Pastor Mark, it's a privilege as a friend, again, the honor that you do this in this time. And I'm excited that this will bless people. I'm excited to listen back, as I always do, but part of this, like I said, was selfish to learn as I would love to write my first. But you've inspired so many. You continue to inspire millions with your books, millions with your preaching, and tens of thousands here in the DC area. I know there's a lot of important people in our government that look to you as their pastor, and in many ways, you're helping lead some of the direction for our nation as you lead those people. And so, I love that we're here in the nation's capital, and I love that you're here leading the way and proclaiming the name of Jesus. So until next time, maybe not 158 more episodes, but thanks for starting it off and keeping us going.
Sounds good. Thanks, Logan.